WotC finally reached out to me about covering their new Dungeon Master's Guide. I mean, they did it way later than everyone else, and they didn't give me any money for it, but I would have turned them down. First of all, let's get this out of the way. The 2024 DMG is way better than the old one, even though there are still some pretty obvious flaws, and I know because I actually read it this time. When I first started DMing, I cracked open the 2014 DMG a handful of times. And each time, the first chapter was like,
yes, here's a list of gods and pantheons for you to use. And have you designed your entire fantasy world yet? You should probably start by creating a list of factions and guilds like these highly detailed ones. And you should definitely start to memorize all of this lore, by the way.
And I was instantly turned off. I don't want to make friggin' flashcards in order to play make-believe with my friends. And half of the people playing D&D never create their own worlds anyway, so why are we leading with this? Great question. The answer is, they shouldn't have. The new DMG opens on a chapter about what a DM actually does, how to prep and run a session, and most importantly, it provides actual examples of play. Nailing the rhythm of a session as a DM can be a really hard thing to fully understand at first. I personally used to copy certain things from my own past DMs, but I didn't know why I was doing it. The examples in this first chapter do a great job of not only illustrating the rhythm and technique for newcomers, but it also provides detailed insights about the reasons for handling certain interactions the way that they suggest. Like why a DM might allow the players to put their characters in danger without constantly divulging every piece of information, or why they might choose to circumvent the rules for the rule of cool instead. Immediately after this, they also include a section about the unique qualities of every DM and the games that they run. Playstyles can vary wildly between serious or silly, pre-planned or improvised, and they even mention that house rules and general atmosphere can also influence your TTRPG experience. It's really a shame that I've already learned what not to do as a DM, but I'm also pretty excited that new prospective DMs won't have the same experience I did. The next chapter then details how to actually run the game mechanically, with nice digestible chunks of information covering things like narration, combat, social encounters, exploration, and even utilizing multiple DMs or managing players that are running multiple characters. That was a pretty interesting read. If I'd wanted to check out some of the same topics in the old DMG, I would have had to wait until Chapter 8. Are we ever actually gonna play D&D?
Oh, gods no! Why would we ever do that when we can theorycraft medieval religions and look at magic items?
They also take a stab at the degrees of success that other systems like Pathfinder have enjoyed for a while. There aren't any strict rules here, but they do a good job of explaining the ideas behind these kinds of approaches, and I'm a fan. Sometimes success comes at a cost. Maybe you just barely pass a check to leap over a crevasse, and so you fall prone on the other side as you hold onto the edge for dear life. And there are degrees of failure too. In their example, you might narrowly fail to disarm a trap, or you might just set it off if you failed the check by a large enough margin. That aside, this section of the 2024 guide does cover mostly the same ground, but it's organized a lot better and it's easier to get through in general. A theme that continues from the 2024 Player's Handbook and through the rest of this book too. But that doesn't change the fact that you'll probably only need to read these first two chapters once. After you've got the knack, you'll hardly need to come back and reference this stuff again. Does that mean that this book contains nothing of real value for seasoned DMs unless you've somehow been doing it wrong this whole time without knowing your players were just not telling you out of fear of sending you into an anxious panic spiral? Yes. I mean, no. Well, it's complicated. You see, the book also contains very specific sections for extraneous rules. For example, the ones regarding every player's worst enemy, doors. Seriously, if you've ever wondered how hard it'd be to break a metal door off the hinges, there's a rule for that now. AC and hit points exist for various types of doors, DCs for picking locks on those doors, how barring a door works with the utilize action, how hard it is to find a secret door, how much cover you gain from standing behind a closed portcullis. It's kinda crazy. It's so crazy, even, you might just choose to ignore some of it, or at the very least, wonder if you'll ever actually use these kinds of specific rules. My Pathfinder friends are probably screaming at me right now, but a lot of this will just serve as a jumping off point for you as you homebrew your own rules or even improvise in session.
No, I promise. There's a rule about hopping one-legged through a tar pit. I just have to find it.
They even have a section back in Chapter 2 that literally spells out how to improvise the appropriate amount of damage corresponding to examples they provide that illustrate intensity. Still, it can be good to know that you're in the right ballpark mechanically with this stuff when your players inevitably find themselves sailing through a powerful storm or attempting to avoid a rock slide triggered by some ill-timed fart humor. And again, a lot of this existed in the old DMG, though you may not have been aware of it. I know I wasn't. Probably the biggest improvement here is the fact that everything is organized a lot better so you can actually find it when you need it, but there is some new stuff too. I'm much more likely to use the section on dungeons now that it's better presented and a lot easier to read. They also include a section on handling things like divine intervention and communing with the gods instead of giving those abilities to your players and leaving you to figure out how the hell you're going to keep your campaign going when they just ask God to solve all their problems. If you want to run a different type of game from the typical flavor of heroic fantasy, there are some bare bones rules for fear and mental stress to get you started alongside some curses and magical contagions that I wouldn't recommend you use without a lot of consideration first. Diseases weren't popular in base 5e, reflavoring them as magical isn't going to change that.
Oh dear, it looks as though you've contracted magical dick dribble. Is that just a term for gonorrhea? No.
That said, one of my main complaints from the 2024 Player's Handbook has been solved with the guidelines for creating custom backgrounds. Yeah, it basically just says do what you want, but that's good enough for me. They also, for the first time ever, give some pretty in-depth guidelines for creating custom creatures. Wait, the first time? Really? What the actual fuck? Oh, wait, no, they actually gave some guidelines in 2014 for creating a monster using a short and simple
20-step process?
No wonder I never knew. This is definitely one of those situations where less is more. Instead of pretending that you've never so much as looked at a stat block before, this new system briefly touches on some of the core elements of a monster and then lays out a bunch of examples for you to steal and pretend you came up with yourself. Truth be told, I actually misunderstood what this section was at first because the creature traits they listed seemed a lot more akin to the flavor we usually see on species options, but that may have even been intentional. So if you've ever thought about creating your own custom species for your games, this wouldn't be a bad place to start. The sections that follow have similarly streamlined the guidelines for creating spells and magic items too, which we shouldn't confuse with the actual magic item crafting system. I'll cover that later. Mostly, they lay out a couple of charts that roughly correspond to the amount of damage or healing new spells should do, and the power of new magic items relative to spells and static bonuses to attack and damage rolls. This is all pretty standard coming from the old DMG, but of course, you already knew that. There's no way you were IKEA world building without reading the instructions, right? You were probably better for it. Really, all of this is pretty useful, but I've always been fine with looking at the power of other spells, monsters, and items, and using that as a rule of thumb for my own homebrew balance. Even though WotC still seems to think that the winged boot should only be uncommon rarity. I guess it does technically abide by their own chart. Technically. Now, I won't be going into every magic item in the book because there are like 400 of them, including roughly 20 completely new ones. That may not seem like a lot, but keep in mind that these aren't just items from the old DMG. This one includes tons of entries from books like Xanathar's and Tasha's too. While I'm not usually a fan of reprints, I'll mark this as a rare exception. Huge swaths of items like this can be hard to parse through when you're not sure what you're looking for, and a lot can be said about having all of that in the same place. What I will cover is the magic item enchanting system that I mentioned earlier, because as it compares to the 2014 version, it's very samey. I'm really surprised that they decided not to do much more than the vague tourism pamphlet that we got before. Seriously, this is pretty much what we got. Okay, I know some people are totally fine with the enchanting rules as they are, but I will happily die on this shameless plug of a hill. I made a video a while back detailing the homebrew that I use for enchanting without all of the needless restrictions that the DMG continues to impose upon players, like proficiency in the Arcana skill, buttloads of time, and dragon buttloads of gold. I'm a child of instant gratification and I don't want to wait. Basically, up until I made those changes, my players never interacted with the crafting system. Now, instead, we consistently get to roleplay through these super evocative and flavorful processes using the raw materials they come across in their adventures. They get to actually feel like what they made represents an extension of their character, rather than waiting on their new wand of fireballs to come in from Amazon 50 days after they actually need it. I could go on forever, so I'll leave it at that, but don't you dare get me started in the comments about how long it takes to smith a greatsword.
And don't you dare subscribe to the channel.
Did it work? Did you do it?
All right, I suppose it's time we go on an adventure.
Finally.
You'll want to start by reading these 3 chapters.
It's about halfway through the book before we actually get to this point, but I really don't mind that. Like I said before, beginner DMs would only need to check out those first couple of chapters once or twice, and the 3rd chapter is sort of a quick reference for specific rules that you may never intend to fully read through. So it's entirely possible that this part of the book is the first thing experienced DMs truly sink their teeth into. And even if you've been DMing for a while, I'd recommend that you do. Now, I'll just come out and say it. I hate running pre-written adventures. Every time I crack open an adventure module, no matter how well designed, I see things that I'd rather run differently, arcs I'd rather do without, and even alternate endings and encounters that I'd rather use. Modules for me very quickly unravel into loose inspirations for my own adventures, and I think a lot of people out there may feel the same way. However, my approach to DMing without ever running these kinds of modules has often left me missing certain wisdoms about running a session more effectively. Not only does the new DMG lay out a simple template for creating adventures, something the old version failed pretty miserably at, but it also provides some bare-bones examples of other adventures that really hammer home what an adventure actually needs. It cites encounters as the building blocks of an adventure before we move on to another chapter completely dedicated to campaigns, which are comprised of strings of adventures. This may seem obvious enough. In fact, it is. But it's worth pointing out yet again the huge improvement to the flow in this book compared to what we had before. Previously, this section on creating your campaign, the setting for it, and the flavor of it were all crammed into chapter 1 with a pretty intimidating top-down approach. In the years since, it's been well established that the far more palatable approach is to design your campaigns and adventures from the bottom up. What I mean by that is something I covered pretty extensively in my guide on world building. You don't need to know every deity, every location, or even every adventure available to your players when you start a campaign. You can far more easily create only what you need as you go, giving your players the illusion of much more detail than is actually present, while also saving you from the common tragic pitfall of putting in hours of work on something that'll never be seen, referenced, or even felt in your sessions. The 2024 guide even cites the importance of a session 0 before you get things rolling, which was surprisingly absent from the old guide given how vitally it's viewed in most playgroups today. It's almost like we just collectively learned how to play the game in a better way without WotC teaching us how.
No, no, no. This is the Dungeon Master's Guide. If you want to be a Dungeon Master, then you need this.
Are you sure about that?
Yes, I mean, without it, how would you know the damage a falling creature should take?
This guy on Reddit has some pretty interesting ideas about terminal velocity.
What about running a game?
I think I've watched enough live plays to get the gist.
But this book contains 40 pages on the Greyhawk setting and cosmology.
Wiki.
Shit.
I understand the value of including a ready-to-run campaign setting within the DMG. I think it's necessary for anyone that has never DM'd before and holds little interest in creating their own worlds, but I don't think it's absolutely vital for everyone. So much of this information is already available online, and I feel only a small subsection of this book's readers will actually use this. Am I slighting WotC for putting this into their DMG? Not at all. But I do want to make clear that what may be a selling point for some may not be for others. Which brings me to my take on the new Bastion system in this book. Giving your players something new to sink their vast riches into is almost never a bad idea, and it brings a whole new aspect of fantasy into your games. Home ownership. I like that this system has the potential to be something the whole party invests in together as a way to solve problems and power up, all while giving the DM an extra plot thread to tug on and eliminating the dreaded shopping sessions that often devolve into endless boring bartering and trivial trades that put the whole table to sleep. Instead, these kinds of interactions can be conducted outside of a session because the players know what's possible, largely without the input of the DM. And best yet, it seems that WotC has learned from the terrible crafting rules that they didn't bother fixing when designing this system. Adding basic facilities like bedrooms, storage, a kitchen, and more will still take tons of time and gold, while special facilities, the ones you'll actually care about, just come into existence when you hit certain character levels. I think this change alone greatly increases the chance that tables will actually adopt this. In my opinion, it carries the right level of complexity and flexibility as opposed to other systems that would require every player at the table to pore over hundreds of pages for the same result. I was actually already running something like this in our own live plays, but I do plan to add this into our games as well if you'd like to see it in action. That all said, the value of something like this will depend on whether or not you plan to use it in your games. And that should be said of this entire book. Do you really need the 2024 DMG? No.
Damn it.
You don't even need this book as a new DM, although it would objectively hold more value in that case. What I think you're actually paying for here is convenience. The convenience of all your magic items being in the same place. The convenience of having a massive chapter of reference rules for you to rely on, and the convenience of campaign settings and new systems without you having to make everything yourself. That convenience alone is probably what makes this book worth picking up for a lot of people, but you definitely shouldn't feel like you can't DM without it. After all, many of us have. And there are plenty of videos on this channel and other channels like it that can help you for free. So subscribe so you don't miss out on any future guides, and until next time, go out there and make some chaos.